So since it's going to be a podcast, our guest today is David Frum, a man who needs no introduction anywhere in the civilized world. He's a staff writer at The Atlantic, former speechwriter for George W. Bush, and the author of a forthcoming book called The Trumpocalypse.
Trumpocalypse.
Which is available now for pre-order.
Thank you.
Get that book. David Frum, welcome to the news.
Thank you. I just want to pay a small tribute to you as we start. Thank you for that kind of introduction, which is, I think for a lot of us who have been on the other side of this president, some of his actions, I think one of the things we've tended to have in common has been that we are older people on sort of the back slope of our careers. I think you are distinguished as being somebody who is in the mid slope of his career. And one of the things that means is you had many fewer certainties in your life and many more risks to run. And I've been really impressed by the way you have risked a lot of those uncertainties and run those dangers at a time when it was probably it was harder for you than for some of us codgers. So
well, thank you.
I just want to salute you for that.
I appreciate that. You're a young guy, but I mean, the fact that you were you were a White House speechwriter, you've written a lot of books, you've got points on the board. Maybe that gives you a little bit of confidence, whereas someone who doesn't have that resume established might think twice.
Well, you're being too modest there. I think it's more that I'm not as young. Kind of you to say I'm not so young, but also I had when you've been through a lot of things and you just know that whatever bad things can happen to you, that there are fewer question marks over the course of your life. And you, at a time when there were a lot of question marks over the course of your life, and there still are, you took some risks, and I just want to salute that.
Well, I appreciate that. I have to tell you, it's been an interesting career, and I remember, so I kind of started doing this around 2007-ish. And I remember being at townhall.com and writing bad stuff about you and Peggy Noonan and David Brooks and Kathleen Parker. And every single one on that list are people that I've actually gotten to know. And I don't know if I've changed, you've changed, or the world has changed, but I just feel like everything you're doing lately, I completely agree with.
Thank you. Well, I think it's to your question. Maybe I'm going to turn off this email because we're getting these strange noises. To that question, I think that obviously it's some of all three, but I think one of the things that has been a problem with the way conservatives think about the world is they've tended to think about their set of beliefs as something unchanging, and to say, I have this joke that there's someone out there who's working on a PhD thesis called Conservative Thought in America, 1619 to 2019, with no awareness of change. And so where the world, what has happened with going through first the financial crisis, the tragic end of the Iraq War, the slow recovery from the financial crisis, the start of the Tea Party movement is something that looked more like a traditional conservative movement of the past and then evolved into something quite different. And then the Trump movement, it's just put us all through, and now this terrible crisis that is going to remake America in so many ways we cannot predict. That if people don't react to that in a dynamic way, then what are they doing with that muscle above their neck?
Yeah. No, I definitely try to be introspective and try to, you don't want to be wishy-washy and waver back and forth. You need to have principles, but by the same token, if you're actually learning, you will presumably be changing your mind about certain things. And I mean, for me, like a big moment, I remember, I think I was working at townhall.com at the time, and Sarah Palin, whom I had really liked and kind of championed early on as a running mate for McCain. This was after maybe like right after she lost. And she was giving a speech at like Concerned Women for America or Susan B. Anthony or something like that. And this is when she unveiled her Mama Grizzly line.
Yeah.
And I was in the room when that happened. And then the next day I was listening to Rush Limbaugh, whom I used to listen to all the time. And I forget the details, but he was describing something about that speech, and it was wrong. And I knew it was wrong because I was in the room. And that was one of the moments that it hit me, like how much of the things that I believed because Rush told me weren't actually true.
Right. Right. Well, I think one of the that's one of the things that happens. I mean, the event. I didn't work in government that long, but in the short period you do, that you see things in a different kind of way. And I think this phenomenon, this reality of change and of living through changing times, and of needing to adapt to that. You know, when you talk about principles, you try to stay committed to them. Uh, One of the things that ideologies do is they take a bunch of commitments that people have and they package them. And the ideology sells the idea that these commitments that have been put into a package are now and will forever remain in harmony with each other. And that commitment tends not to be honored because it can't be. And so what will happen, and this has been one of the themes of the Trump years, is that everybody has commitments. And what we've discovered in the Trump years, many of us, especially those who started on the conservative side of politics, is those commitments have come into conflict, and then you've had to rank order them and say,
Right.
what are my fundamental commitments? I mean, for me, and I think one of the reasons that I was one of the earlier people, for me, and I didn't know this at the start, but I learned it from the process of going through the Trump years. The post-World War II settlement of the Western world. That was my top commitment. Free trade, the US guaranteed security order, that widening circle of democracy that spread from the English-speaking countries, then to the western half of the continent of Europe, then into the most favored parts of Northeast Asia, and then broader, then to the Pacific Rim, then to parts of Latin America, then into the eastern half of Europe, with hope that it could someday possibly even reach into Russia, maybe even conceivably reach into China. We were wrong about those hopes, but those were the hopes. That was for me bedrock. And the Trump years, and one of the things that became clear for Trump, who has so many different commitments. Sometimes he's pro-life, sometimes he's not. Sometimes he thinks this way. The one thing he has believed in since 1988 is that fundamental commitment of mine he rejects. And that is, he thinks it's wrong. He thinks America is alone. He thinks these alliances are all taking advantage of the United States. NATO's a ripoff. Free trade's a ripoff. And I just look at this,
Yeah.
where you go, everywhere, every which way you want to go, I have to go the opposite way.
No, that's a really good insight. And I think, you're right. I mean, conservatism means different things. And if you care about institutions, if you care about the rule of law, if you care about prudence or a conservative temperament, what we used to call a conservative temperament, if you just care about like actual family values,
Yeah.
so many quote unquote conservative things that if you really believe in them, you couldn't possibly also like Donald Trump at the same time.
Right. And I think conservatism is one of those things. It's just part of the structure of the human brain. And there's Jonathan Haidt and others have done a lot of research on this, on just how, we human beings are born with a range of brain chemistries. Some of us are more prone to like the familiar. Some of us are more prone to be interested in the unfamiliar. Some of us are risk averse. Some of us are risk favorable. And those deep psychic tendencies that are just part of the common nature of humanity, in different societies, they express themselves in different political terms. So you will look conservative, whatever that means in your local society. But in the American context, we've also been through, this country's been through a lot. I used to have this joke during the Bush years. The Bush years started with Pearl Harbor, ended with the Great Depression, and had Vietnam in between. And the pace of events has only accelerated since 2009. And we have a world in which people remain active into their 80s, which was not true half a century ago. So it's not that back then, you would start in political life in your late teens, early 20s, and maybe you'd go to your early or middle 60s. Now it's 20 years more, or a quarter more of a human life. And you are that much more prone to find yourself toward the latter part of your life in a different world from the world in which you spent the earlier part of your life.
Let's talk about your column today in the Atlantic, where
Yes, thank you.
You talk about basically Donald Trump, who really wasted months of time preparing for this pandemic and seems to
Yeah.
have botched it, and how, I mean, look, I personally think this will probably end up being the defining question about the election and maybe even his legacy.
Yes. Well, so the article for The Atlantic started with this observation. It's often made. Look, the pandemic started in China, and was made worse than it maybe had to be because of the negligence. We hope it's negligence of the Chinese authorities. It could be, you know, deliberate cover-up. But the Chinese authorities did lost control of it, lied about it, suppressed it, threatened people who tried to tell the truth about it, and they lost the middle part of December when this thing might have been responded to more effectively. So it starts in China, and that's just, yeah, there it is. But that's an external threat to the United States. Donald Trump has wanted to say what happened in China between, say, the 10th and the 20th of December. That is where everyone should focus their attention. And I want to write a reply to that to say, look, let's just take Chinese wrongdoing, incompetence, malfeasance, whatever it was. Let's just take that for granted, because it's a world full of adverse events. The reason we have presidents is, in a world full of adverse events, someone has to look out for the interests of the United States. So where were you from Christmas to March 20th? Because we now know that March 20th is when March 21st, March 13th is when the president admits this is a big deal. And March 21st is when the White House finally begins to get organized to do something. So where were you from Christmas to March 21st? And that's what this piece is about. And it has been well reported how Trump was completely negligent in the 2 or 3 years before. As I think the world has now seen, George Bush got very focused in 2005, 2006 on the dangers from pandemic, influenced by David Petrushka here, is interested partly by a book that he read about the history of the epidemic of 1918, but also I think there was a serious outbreak of bird flu in 2005 that alarmed a lot of people, and it didn't have serious effect. But I remember being in discussions about it at the time, and people were this was a harbinger, our new, more globalized world, China being more integrated in the world, Chinese or diseases of Chinese origin would spread more. We need to do something. So Bush set the government in motion. We need to think about this. The Obama people inherited the Bush concern, and there's a lot more continuity between Bush and Obama than I think. Well, the Trump people are right about this. There was a lot of continuity between Bush and Obama, and there was a very strong personal relationship in the end between Bush and Obama. And so the Obama people took this concern of Bush's and turned it into institutions. There was another pandemic outbreak in 2009. There was Ebola in 2014. And the Obama people said, we need to build a government apparatus to be ready for this concern originally spoken of by President Bush. And Trump dismantled that. But even having dismantled it, there was still time and time and time for him to do various responsive things, beginning about Christmas time, certainly by the first week in January, and he didn't do it. And that's what the piece is about.
So I'd love to hear your take, because you've seen, you obviously worked for George W. Bush. I remember when Bush was beloved by Republicans and conservatives, and then the second term, the Iraq War goes south, Hurricane Katrina, and then the housing market collapses, and now we have a situation where the current Republican president badmouths the last Republican president. So the point here is that fortunes fade and that the public are fickle. What happens? Because there is now I don't know what the percentage, but there's a decent chance that Trumpism is to a certain degree discredited, and that Trump, who has always cast himself as a winner, will not be seen as a winner going forward. Is there a scenario where those people who have been backing Trump, I'm talking about the elites now who are backing Trump, where they decide to wash their hands of him, and how does that look? Yeah,
well, unless these pills that Trump and Fox News are promoting turn out to be miracle wonder drugs that go into effect tomorrow, it is hard to see how his president ends non-catastrophically. And I mean, we're all trying to be optimistic about the course of this pandemic, and I'm sure that American ingenuity and the collaboration of scientists all over the world are going to yield results that we can be optimistic about the course of the disease. But or we should try, and I think we can reasonably try. But the impact on the American economy is going to be painful. Last Friday, we can't. The unemployment rate is rising faster than economists can tally, but the best guess were that last Friday the unemployment rate was 13%, and by this Friday it will probably be closer to 20, and by the end of the month we're going to have near depression levels of unemployment. Now let's say we get this thing under control June 1. That would be amazing, to get the disease under control, and we begin to be able to reopen things. How optimistic can we be about the course of unemployment? And I just, if you, one of the ways the American economy is different from the way it used to be is that we, in the recessions of 1990 to 91, 2001, which were relatively mild recessions, we discovered that we were suddenly returning to full employment, not full out. We were returning to full employment much slower than we used to do. Even after we'd returned to pre-crisis levels of output, the jobs came back slower. And I've made some charts on this that I've circulated among some friends and associates, that if you look at the bad recessions before 1990, 1958, 1974, 1982, those are the three worst. They're perfect V's. You fall into the valley of the shadow and you emerge from the valley of the shadow at almost the same peak rate that you go into the valley of the shadow. But starting in 1990, they look more and more like check marks. And the line in is fairly steep and the line out is fairly slow. And when you have shallow recessions like 1990 or 2001, you're out within a couple of years. When you have a deep recession like 2008, it took until the end of the Obama presidency before we were back at the 5% unemployment that we'd been at just before we entered the crisis. So let's say, even if we do well, I mean, we're not going to be out of this in 24 months. We're certainly not going to be out of it by November of 2020. So Donald Trump is going to go to the polls in an atmosphere of very high unemployment, even if the worst of the illness is behind us. And he's going to be arguing, this is China's fault, don't blame me. He's going to have a whole list of excuses. And we're going to test the power of the president to convince people to blame somebody else. Now, I'm doubting he's going to be successful. I think the Republican Party is going to pay the price down the ballot. And this is going to look like 1896, 1920. We have an expert on 1920 here, and 1932, yes. Where the party of the president just gets hammered because of an economic event that they lost control of. And they have, although they'll have many more excuses and very powerful media, they will have not as good. People in 1920 and 1932 had much better excuses for the failure to get recovery than Donald Trump will have in 2020.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. I mean, Donald Trump is really good at casting sort of alternative realities and making people suspend disbelief and engage in this delusional thinking. He's a master at that. But he was already teetering with a great economy. So I don't know how you can go from teetering with a great economy to winning with a which I think will still be not a good economy.
Well, that's especially true. I think that's exactly right. And that's especially true when you sort of try to figure out, Donald Trump seems to have gotten this kind of bump in the latter part of February and the early part of March of this year. That suddenly suddenly people became aware of the disease, and they then became aware there was a kind of flurry of action in Washington, the appearance of action, and the president was suddenly on TV a lot more. He wasn't doing those rallies, and Americans they want the president to be presidential. They didn't like the rallies, they didn't like the tweeting, but there he was standing at the podium in the West Wing, looking sort of like a president and dealing with the issues a president should. You got a little rally effect. But when you look more closely at that rally, what was going on? Who was rallying to him? What seemed to be happening, and things were so dynamic and the polling was not great, but as I read it, what seemed to be happening was that Donald Trump had held his support among non-college educated white men. He had just made it with non-college educated white women in 2016, and they had then drifted away from him over the course of his presidency, partly in response to healthcare and partly in response to not liking his behavior. They came back. And he also seems to have made a little pickup. He had done better than you might have thought in 2016 with Latino men. Latino is as I don't have to tell anyone, you follow American politics closely, it's a category that doesn't describe the world very, because it's made up of so many different people from so many different realities. But still, we use it. He seemed to make a little inroad among Latino men. But the Latinos are suffering unemployment. This is these events. Blacks are suffering disproportionately from the disease, and Latinos are suffering disproportionately from the layoffs. And everyone's suffering from both. But it's, I think, hurting his support among these two. So these groups that gave him his rally, I think, are now, he's losing them. And even if he holds the non-college white base, or holds most of it, he can't win with that. And as the unemployment gets worse, I assume he begins to suffer among them too.
There's obviously a danger in being perceived as gloating over the suffering of Americans, including people that I'm sure you and I both know. But, you know, I do feel like in some ways there could be like, we could be, I'm trying to think of the word here. You know, we could essentially be proven right. I mean, I've always felt like Trump's fundamental flaws of a lack of character and decency and honesty and competence would eventually catch up to him. And every time they didn't, I looked stupid. Like I just didn't get that the world had changed, man. Those things don't matter anymore. And I guess the word I was looking for is vindicated. But as you point out, we'll never get, even if Trumpism is discredited, no one will ever say, you know what, David, you were right all along. I should have listened.
No, look, one of my favorite scenes in all of Hollywood is seen a movie, The King of Comedy. And if you haven't seen it, and we're all shut in, it's a movie to watch. So Robert De Niro has his fantasy life. He wants to be a comedian, but he's not very talented. And so the solution he comes up with is he kidnaps the Johnny Carson-like figure played by Jerry Lewis to threaten his way onto the program. And
like the Joker, if people
exactly like that. But he has this fantasy about what he wants. And what he wants is, he has this dream sequence where he's on the program and his old high school principal appears before him on the show and says, Rupert Popkin, that's the name of the character, Rupert Popkin, tonight in front of 75 million Americans, on behalf of everyone who made fun of you in high school, I want to say that you were right and we were wrong. Okay. It's a dream sequence. It doesn't happen. So it's hard. I can't tell you how little I care about what people think of me. I mean, I've got, you know, that saying about a friend of, well, I've got 2 dogs. My daughter is here. She's got a 3rd dog. I got 3 dogs here. So I got 3 friends in Washington. You know, I have my own interests, you know, and I've made enough of my own mistakes that if I get negative blowback, I may not get blowback for the things I deserve, but there are enough things where I did deserve blowback that, you know, karmic justice is being served. I have no complaints. But what I care about a lot, and you know, you're a younger person, you feel differently about this, but I'm not looking for anyone to say that I was right. I'm looking, my God, I just see the country beset by terrorism, not just the country, but the world. I mean, we are going through this pandemic, and we are attacking the Constitution of 1787, the idea of a single market among the states. There is a United States of America that can make judgments collectively. We are behaving this way of national egoism, country, ally against ally. I mean, who is going to trust the United States out there in the world? And I worry about and the stability of American democratic institutions, whether Americans can go back to being people respectful of each other. And my kids are now young people. I mean, what is going to happen? What kind of country are they going to live in? You know, I'm haunted by, I'm originally from Canada, and so British Empire history is very real to me. I'm haunted by stories of people like Anthony Eden, who was prime minister in the middle 1950s. So these are people who grow up at a time when Britain was the acknowledgedly greatest power on earth. And they, as middle-aged people, they lived in a country that was a second power on its way to being a 3rd power. And they just couldn't cope with it psychically. And they made terrible decisions. And a world in which the United States is not at the core of an alliance of like-minded countries is going to be a very dangerous and upsetting world. And that's not the world I want for my kids. So I think, but when you talk about vindication, I mean, I think the process of getting from here to there is going to be painful, so painful that, you know, maybe it was not ever going to be possible that Donald Trump was proven right, but, you know, God help us for the pain of proving them wrong.
Well, I have a bunch of questions, but I'll end with those. Let me invite in, maybe I'll just do it one at a time to start. We have a handful of friends and supporters of the podcast who are joining us on this Zoom call. And let's maybe invite them in. David Petrusha, author of 1920 and other great books, including 1932 and TR's The Last Battle. Any questions or comments, sir?
Two questions, unrelated to each other. The first is, David, I think you said a while back that W was influenced to some extent by his epidemic policy after reading my 1920. Did you?
No, it wasn't it was the great influenza.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, a whole book on that. Sure.
Right. So he read that, and he's talked. Some people around him talked about that. So he read that on summer vacation.
That seems unlikely to me, but I know that Bush had read 1920.
Yeah. It was the pandemic book that flipped him out, and he read that, I think, on summer holiday 2005, and he came back, then said, we have to start thinking about this.
That's one of the things that people don't know about Bush is how much he read.
Yeah.
He had this contest with Karl Rove about reading a book a week, and made Rove read 1920.
Yeah. Right.
You read it of free will.
but one of the things, having written for Bush, this is a point that I think people notice how much difficulty Bush had speaking.
Yes.
And they therefore inferred that he must be illiterate. And one of the things we learned when writing for Bush is Bush had a processing difficulty that was the opposite of dyslexia. So a dyslexic is somebody who has difficulty processing on the way in. They can't read easily, but they're perfectly intelligent, and they can process perfectly well on the thoughts they form in their mind. They can express very naturally. I don't know if there's a word for it, but Bush had the opposite. Inbound information he could process perfectly easily. It was the outbound with which he had trouble, and he would make characteristic mistakes, of which probably the ones that are most familiar is if you gave him a 3-syllable word, he would turn it into a 4-syllable word. The famous misunderestimate. He would drop in random extra syllables into long words. Not because he would never write misunderestimate, he would write underestimate perfectly correctly. But if he had to speak it, he would add, and there are many, I used to have them all at there are 14 or 15 of these that I would see, and you just knew when you were writing for him, you had to be careful. There were certain words that guaranteed the insertion of an extra syllable. But he read fiendishly, and he read very much in history and very much in the history of a century ago. I was a special concern.
Now, my second question is, first a comment, is that we've had this whole conversation about the upcoming election, among other things, and there's one word which hasn't come up at all, and that word is Biden. Okay, and there's an old saying in politics: you can't beat somebody with nobody, and Joe Biden is turning into nobody day by day.
Well, of all the people in America to make that point, I would not have thought it would be you, because the election of 1920 is the election that shows you can beat somebody with nobody.
Well, wait a minute. He beat Cox.
Okay, but
Harding was two guys who were essentially the same guy running against each other, and a newspaper editor from Ohio running against a newspaper editor from Ohio.
But it's hard to imagine a bigger mediocrity than Warren Harding. I have this joke that I've been making about how I say that Trump is the worst human being ever to be president. I include all the slaveholders, and I go through like all the presidents with bad qualities. You could say like Tyler was an affectionate father. James Buchanan was very well traveled. Richard Nixon very well read, and Warren Harding is my punchline. Warren Harding at least was fun at a party. But let me ask you. I have a question for you, actually.
Yeah. Okay.
Because do you think that the pandemic of 1918-19 was implicated at all in the wave of pogroms and racial attacks that took place in 1920 to 21?
Pogroms, racial attacks.
Chicago, Detroit.
Oh yeah, like in 1919, Chicago and East St. Louis earlier.
Right, and culminating in Tulsa as the last and worst.
A little bit. I don't think there's a connection there. I mean, it's just so much bigger than everything else. What it is related to is World War I. And I mean, the main theory is that it starts at or outside an army base in Kansas, and then is completely aggravated by, you know, you know, cleaning out the colleges. I think was a good thing. Cleaning out dormitories is a good thing. Cleaning out where people live together and could spread germs. I'm talking about today.
Yeah.
A good thing. And you had this thing going, you had one thing after another. The soldiers are in barracks, they're in troop ships, they're in trenches, they're in campgrounds, and then they're crowded together in hospitals. Then you have, what is it, 30,000? I can't remember the number offhand now. A huge amount of American physicians overseas. So you have all those things going on, which are going to aggravate it. And the movement of people from continent to continent with troop movements, which was unprecedented, really, in the history of the world, even counting the 7 Years' War, which was really the First World War, but people weren't moving around like crazy like in 1918 or so. So all of those things are what I think makes it so much worse in 1918 and then 1919. And then you get that, and then the things people let down their guard, where you get first wave, the second wave is the big, and then you get the third wave coming in. So like, we were riding around yesterday, and after that doctor, was it Burks? How is that pronounced?
Yeah.
Was saying to everyone, the next week is going to be, horrible. Do not go to a grocery store. Do not go to a pharmacy. And we're riding around safe and sound, not stopping at any establishments. And I see parking lots filled at both those places. And I worry that we are going to let down we're spoiled people right now. And I don't know how long we can have patience. What you're saying about people turning on Trump or whatever, I don't know how long we're going to be patient about anything. That's my philosophy.
Let me see. It looks like Carrie Mickelson here, our friend. She just unmuted. Let me go to you, Carrie.
I'm dressed like Doug today. No.
We don't have any video, but if you have a question.
And this is just an amazing treat, as always. I too worry about the irreparable damages with our allies, our allied countries. Do you think, if, like, by hope and prayer that Trump doesn't get reelected, is this something that a new president can quickly fix, or is this going to take a couple of years to fix, or how far down the rabbit hole have we dug ourselves? I don't even know if that's even a term.
Well, I tend to respond to that by citing one of the vast number of jokes that sounded better in the original Yiddish, but still work in English, which is the Jewish mother to her son, forgiving her son for his derelictions. You'll forget it, Sheldon, and I'll forget it, Sheldon, but I won't forget it, Sheldon, and don't you forget it, Sheldon. Look, you're a prudent German chancellor of 10 years from now, and you're making your plans. And Trump's gone, and Biden is long gone, and now you have whoever's president 10, 12 years from now, and they seem like a plausible person, and there have been another dozen years of NATO conferences. Are you ever going to forget that Donald Trump happened? I mean, the fact that something happened is good proof that it can happen. And you may think, well, let's hope that never happens again, and it doesn't seem likely. But in your planning, you say, how sure are we, as we plan for contingencies in the future, that we can absolutely trust the United States? How sure are we of that? I think the answer has to be less. And one of the things that we're on our way to right now, and this is something not at all theoretical, but we need really to worry a lot about. So one of everybody's points of vulnerability in this pandemic has been that so much of the world's medical supplies come from China, and that has been a real fact, and it had an impact directly on American politics. You can see that Donald Trump starts talking about the so-called Chinese virus, or the Wuhan virus, about the 13th of March, at a time when he's desperately in need of an excuse. And he ramps it up, and the people at Fox News pick it up, and and there's about 2 weeks of it. And on the 26th of March, he says it in a tweet, he says it at a press conference, and he says it on the Sean Hannity show. On the 27th, he has a phone call with President Xi of China, and he never uses the phrase again after that call. So Xi said something to him, and I don't know what it was, but we can guess, and it was something like, do you want your orders for N95 masks filled fast or slow? And because a lot of people, that some of our longshore people, their feelings have been hurt, and they find they don't work as fast when their feelings are hurt as when their feelings are not hurt. And Trump is not, I think he may have used it once in some stray remark, but he has stayed very clear. And now you can see that even the Fox News messaging is backing away from using the phrase. Okay, so this is a real vulnerability. We need to correct it. Now, how do we correct it? Well, one way we can correct it is that the United States says we need our own national medical supply chain that we can trust that is inside the United States. Okay, well, the United States is 330 million people, more or less the largest economy in the world. Now, what does Europe do? Well, if the United States has its own national supply chain, the EU has to have its own national supply chain. What does Britain do? They're not in the EU anymore. What does Canada do? What does Japan do? What does Australia do? And we're back into a world of national provision. And so I think one of the things that that is going to be a real decisive is, can we understand that relying on China is a problem, but that doesn't mean we must only rely on ourselves. And that we can have pan-Western supply chains that are going to be cheaper and more efficient. That having providers with markets of 1.5 billion people in the developed world, but minus China, is going to be a lot better than having a market of 330 million in the United States and 350 million in Europe and whatever it is in Japan and Great Britain. So I worry about that a lot. And those are examples of things where we are going to need to work together, and we're going to be real tested. But the egoism that President Trump has shown is going to affect the calculations of our friends.
Doug Anderson, let's bring you into the conversation.
So I guess I would somewhat, I'm no fan of the president, that's for sure. And I think he's like, not just on a competence level, not a very good president. On the other hand, I can see a situation where things are getting, you have the summer, things are getting much better. And you have a Democratic candidate who, and he has, and Trump, for all his faults, has advocated for getting people back to work. He is certainly more so than many others on the national stage. And if you have a Democratic candidate that is reflexive in opposition to that, I can see how the message to a lot of the Hispanics, Blacks, other blue-collar people who have been really hurt by this may have a great deal of appeal, notwithstanding his questionable competence. So I guess when's the election? That's what's now April. That's 7 months away. I don't know. Things look very different these days. Every few months, I can see things looking a lot different then. So I certainly do not completely discount the possibility that there is Trump re-election for reasons that are completely different than what we see today.
Well, without gainsaying what you say about the politics, because that does get a little wizardry, let's just talk about with the job number. How fast can we expect employment to come back? So I don't carry these numbers around in my head. I was looking at them for another reason just before we spoke. So on the eve of the crisis, about 10% of American workers worked in the restaurant industry. That's about 14.5 million jobs. How many of those jobs do we think are going to be back by November?
Oh, yeah, not a lot. That's for sure.
Not a lot. About 15.5 million people worked in retail, and that has been trending down. Anyway, 2016 is the peak year for we lose about almost more than 500,000 jobs between 2016 and 2019 in retail. Technological change, CVS, Walmart is going. So now the stores are shut, non-essential businesses, and those retail employees. How fast? I don't think we're ever going to see 15.5 million people working in retail ever again, even if it's boom times in the 2020s. And so you just go industry by industry, and you say, let's imagine that it's a good scenario, and that the federal stimulus works, and the monetary policy works, and we are definitely feeling like life is returning. This is what was so frustrating to President George H.W. Bush in 1992. There's no question that the U.S. economy was expanding in the fall of 1992. But U.S. employment was not. And in fact, unemployment would continue to rise until 1993. And it's only in 1994 that the unemployment numbers peak and begin to improve. And I think there is, again, I'm not making a political point, just an economic observation. I think something has changed about the way the economy works, where, the classic post-war recession is 1958, where there's trouble in the automobile industry of various kinds, and Ford, GM, and Chrysler lay off a bunch of unionized workers in 58, and that ramifies all through the automobile industry, and then everybody—
the Republican Party takes a huge hit that year.
Exactly, and everyone who sells shoes and hats and mittens to auto families and their kids, they all take a hit. And then the 1959, the auto factories recall their unionized workers. The supply chains come back to life, and everyone who sells shoes and hats and mittens to those families, they come back to life. And by 1960, the economy's back at normal employment again. Boom, boom. But because we are less an economy of giant industries with giant workforces that are laid off in huge waves and recalled in huge waves, because it's much more individual entrepreneurs making a decision to turn on the lights, it just takes slower. And so whatever that says about the president's chance, I think about this as an economist, or not, as a pseudo-economist, as a Peter Navarro economist, that I really worry about the economic trend line going forward. Do you disagree with that, Doug?
So I think we're probably less dynamic in some ways than previous. It's harder to start business than it was in those days. On the other hand, you have, I'd say, a couple points in response. One is that you have a gig economy that is possible now in ways that it was not before. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out in terms of people getting back to work, how they get back to work. The second thing is that, don't underestimate the direction of the change as opposed to the amount of change too. If we're really at 30% unemployment and you're at 10% unemployment come October, like maybe that looks pretty good. I don't know.
Yeah. No, I don't want to say you're wrong about that, but it's hard for me to imagine that Donald Trump is going to have a good economic story in December. Although, as you say, it may be an improving economic story. Let's hope to God it's an improving economic story.
And hopefully Joe Biden and the Democrats say something other than like, he was terrible, we should have listened to the experts. I don't think that's a winner. They should be saying similar things like, we've got to get people back to work, not just everyone stay home and keep cashing checks, because that's terrible.
Well, David, we've talked a lot about current events, understandably, but when you write a book like Trumpocalypse, it's probably, I don't know how much lead time nowadays. I think when I wrote my book, I turned it in, the draft in 6 months before it even published. Talk about the idea, what gave you the idea for the book, and also let me throw this out to our listeners, just the importance of pre-ordering books. As someone who's an author, I cannot stress enough, go and pre-order Trumpocalypse. If you like this, if you want to show some appreciation for David for coming on here, that's the best thing you could do.
Okay to do it on Amazon, or do you get is it better to go directly to a site?
From my point of view, it's all the same. What I am encouraging people to do is to, if it's convenient for you, you can place it with an independent bookseller, because these are such important institutions in our community, and they're very important to authors. I have a lot of advantages. I've got a lot of media platforms, but for author, there are a lot of books that are sold because somebody wanders into a bookstore to get a cup of coffee and a piece of cake, and they get into a conversation with the owner, and the owner says, you love this, try this. And that doesn't happen at the Amazon. And those stores are really important to maintaining a literate culture. And they are in terrible trouble right now. So we have some great stores in Washington, Politics and Prose around the corner from me, but every community has them. I visited on my last book tour with Parnassus Books in Nashville, Tattered Cover in Denver. These are really important community institutions, and they are, like all small retailers, in terrible trouble. And I'm just going to assert this. I think that they are especially important, small retailers. And so if you can, I would take it as a personal kindness. I think you're doing a good deed for our culture if you say, you know what, if there's one in my community, please do. But Amazon's great too, and they do a great job. So the story of the book. I've written 2 books about Donald Trump. The first was called Trumpocracy, and it was a study, as the title suggests, of Donald Trump's power. And I was not interested in the court gossip. I was interested, how is it? And I was also interested, this came out of a series of articles I'd done for The Atlantic in 2017. He's not a fascist dictator. That's not the problem. The essence of the abuse of power is Donald Trump is a con man who's in constant legal danger. And it's not like he's got some vision for seizing power in the United States and he's going to deliberately work to overthrow the democratic institutions. Is that he's in constant legal danger and he just cannot have. And we're seeing now just this very day with the inspectors general, because he's hoping to use the money that is in the control of the government to extract favors and to get benefits. He can't have independent-minded people in charge. So that was the thing. Trumpocracy was written dealt on with work I'd done all the way back to 2014, but the beginning to end of that book was done in about 4 months over the summer of 2017 and published early in 2018. Trumpocalypse started with a question after Trumpocracy. My publisher said to me, so what happens after Trump? And especially what happens to people like you, sort of conservative-ish people, center-right-ish people, what happens to you folks? And so I began trying to write an answer to that. And that was a much slower and much, frankly, more difficult, much more fits and starts process. And it was also written with I was convinced as it went along. I began when things seemed to be going well for Trump, but through the trade wars of 2019, I became convinced that we were going to see a recession in 2021. And what I was worried about was that Donald Trump was going to sort of find some way to eke it out in 2020. And then because of his trade policies, we were going to have really bad troubles in 2021. And I had the sense of trouble ahead. And that what we were going to, and there was, because of that, there's a real question of whether or not what we were going to have a permanent kind of choice between social democracy and the National Front in the United States, which is a choice I find not very appealing. So I wrote this over 2 years, and then the publisher suggested the title Trumpocalypse. I thought that seems a little hot, seems a little out there, but I was worried about trade wars, so we agreed to use the title. And then we got an actual apocalypse, alas. And then they did an amazing thing, which publishers can do, which is they allowed me to take the book back, rewrite the first quarter of it, and actually throw out the first quarter. And then I had about a week and a half to rewrite the first quarter.
Oh, that's great.
So it has a chapter on the pandemic. And then it's much more explicit about the dangers to alliances that are going to come out of the selfish policy we've had. And
it's out next month in May, right?
It's out. The pub date is May 12th, but because of just the difficulty of supply chains, it's going to begin to be released. It's a much more of a rolling release, and this is one of the reasons why the independent bookstores are. I'm concerned about them, because Amazon will have the book by May 12th. Your local bookstore, has to make a very bold decision whether to order in bulk or not. And so your advance order puts money in the bookseller's pocket, so the bookseller is less frightened to order books, and we'll have inventory and we'll be able to sell them.
All right, everybody, go get it, pre-order, order Trumpocalypse. David, I feel like I could talk to you for hours, but I want to be respectful of your time. We've been talking for like 45 minutes at least now, so I just let me thank everyone who is supporting us, who supports the podcast on Patreon. We couldn't do it without you. And then thank you everyone who joined us on this Zoom call. And then, of course, especially thank you, David Frum, for being here.
Truly a pleasure. And thank you all for, Doug, David, Carrie, thank you for your questions. It was a pleasure to talk to you. And Matt, thank you for hosting, and good luck with the show.
Thank you. I just pre-ordered it right now from my Queenian bookstore.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you.